Okay, great. So hope you had a great conference these past 2 days. Delighted to be here, notwithstanding the cold. I just got back from a business trip to Asia last night, so wow, I didn't really expect this weather. But still very delighted to be here. I'm just going to spend just a minute or two introducing Cognizant and our partnership with Medidata. So Cognizant is a $16.5 billion company. We have a very deep investment in life sciences. We work with 30 of the top 30 biopharma companies and 12 of the top 15 medical devices manufacturers. One of the great recognitions that we had in the last 2 years was we were regarded as the leader in digital services by Everest, the analyst Everest, who apparently presented yesterday as well. So really delighted to have that accolade. Thank you, Medidata, for having me here. We have a great partnership with Medidata. We've had this partnership for the last 10 years, largely around implementation of their platforms. But more recently, the partnership has evolved a lot more strategically. We're not just implementing their platforms. Medidata also leverages Cognizant for IT services. We have a go-to-market strategy around several products, from ECOA to EDC to Acon AI and several others. And some of our platforms are also getting tightly integrated. For example, the work that we're doing on the shared investigator platform, which is an industry-level platform, is being integrated with Medidata payments so that you can have seamless payments to investigators. So great partnership, and thanks, guys, for having me. All right. Edward mentioned digital disruption and innovation. I'm going to speak more in reference to clinical research. I want to start off by mentioning something that a client of mine said a few months back, which just kind of like one of those things that just sticks in your head, right? So he said, Srini, the 20th century was actually the era of physics. Think about commercial aviation, space exploration, personal computing, industrial automation, nuclear revolution. So it's really the era of physics predominantly. And he went on to say that the 21st century is going to be characterized as the era of biology, right? So think about it. Gene editing is not science fiction anymore. Many of you in the audience here represent companies that are doing novel research with very novel mechanisms of action, like anti-PD-1 and several others in disease areas like oncology and Alzheimer's. CAR T-cell therapy is really ushering in an age of personalized medicine. For like $99 or $149, depending upon the deal, you can actually get your DNA genotyped, which is different from sequencing your DNA with folks like 23andMe. That was actually an interesting phrase that somebody mentioned around this whole DNA genotyping. He called it recreational genetics. We're actually in the era of recreational genetics. And really, if you think about 10 years back, I've been in the industry for about 16 years. If you think about 10 years back, what was the lingua franca? It was loss of exclusivity, patent cliffs, revenue challenges, and big pharma. The lingua franca has changed. There's never been a more exciting time to be in life sciences. So a lot of the times our clients ask us about what's the future look like, whether it's drug discovery or clinical research or pharmacovigilance. So we have a think tank. It's called the Center of Future of Work. And it's like, their job description is crystal ball gazing. They actually look at technologies that are out to disrupt our industry verticals that we serve, and they come up with really pretty seminal pieces of work, some of which is characterized here. I think the one which I wanted to mention is the one on the top right. We actually did a very seminal study called the Study of Healing. We have a group in Cognizant based on certain acquisitions. We have a group of behavioral scientists and medical anthropologists. Apparently, we have the largest set of medical anthropologists outside of academia in the private sector today. So this is a study, a very immersive study, where they looked at many therapeutic areas and came up with certain inferences around how people heal. And one of the biggest inferences that's actually driving a lot of our consulting work today is that the entire industry is focused on medicating, which is driving to medical outcomes, reduce A1C levels, reduce LDL levels, while the patient has a desire for healing. The patient really cares about quality of life outcomes. There was a reference to a diabetic patient who really said, to me, healing is about how many biking trips I'm able to make with my buddies, right? And the reason I say this is that it has a significant implication around areas like clinical research, especially patient engagement in clinical research. What if clinical trials are designed in a way that in addition to clinical endpoints, you're actually looking at quality of life endpoints? It can have a significant impact on patient retention in clinical trials. So that's the kind of work that we do at the Center of Future Work in Cognizant. Happy to share that study separately. So we at Cognizant love this slide. And the reason we love this slide is because it's 6 years old. The proof is the reference to smart glasses. We know what happened with that. But the reason we love this slide is because in the 6 years, technology disruption is playing out exactly the way we'd kind of predicted in some sense, right? So let me start with Google. Google, with its investments in Verily, Calico, and DeepMind, and several other ventures, perhaps has the highest number of irons in the fire, right? Specifically around clinical research, their Project Baseline, which essentially is an open clinical trial registry where patients, not just patients, even healthy people can actually participate in studies with a lot of analytical tools and wearables to create high-quality data to drive clinical inferences. And this is not just some cool project in the wayside. Today, Verily announced earlier this year partnerships with Novartis, Sanofi, Otsuka, and Pfizer around clinical research. So this is serious stuff, and it's really happening. Apple, we've done a lot of research studying devices and the impact in life sciences of wearables and stuff like that. If you look at Apple, their center of control or our axis of control is the smartphone. And their currency are the apps, okay? So all of you are probably familiar with Apple Health, but that's not all. Apple actually has the Health Kit where third-party developers can actually build relevant applications using actually data from healthcare providers, from EMR, EHR data from healthcare providers. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are about 120 beta providers who actually have consented to providing data to people who are actually developing apps with the Apple Health Kit, provided obviously the patient gives consent. So tomorrow or today, you can actually go to your provider portal and consent your data, whether it's a Cleveland Clinic or wherever, to actually share data with these apps based on what you feel is valuable to you. That's bringing EMR and EHR to the smartphone. It's never happened before, right? Tim Cook went on record and said that, in his opinion, the healthcare market makes the smartphone market look small. So that's the size of the opportunity that they are going after, and has significant implications on clinical research, especially around patient identification. Amazon, not really very close in the clinical research side, but mostly focused on, with their acquisition of PillPack, going after the $500 billion prescription drug market, kind of disintermediating the PBMs, if you will, right? I mean, that's really their play, especially with the venture that they have with JP Morgan Chase and Berkshire Hathaway, which is now called Haven. So again, pretty interesting stuff that's happening in the world today. However, we live in a very sobering world of clinical research, right? A lot of times when we present this slide, people say, it's like on Sunday night, you watch Iron Man do all this fancy augmented reality. On a Monday morning, you can't get Outlook to work. So it's kind of like that feeling where you see all this happening, but you're really not, you're still in this sobering world of clinical research. If you think about the clinical development process, 57% of protocols undergo a substantive amendment. 50% of that is avoidable. The implications and the consequences of a substantive amendment is about $500 million, about 3 months of delay and about $500 million impact. If you look at the long poles in the tent, site identification and patient recruitment, 11% of all investigator sites don't even recruit a single patient. Only 13% actually overexceed or overachieve their enrollment targets. Out of 100 patients who are pre-screened, only 7 actually complete the trial. These are very, very sobering metrics. The good part is that when you're sober, you can only get higher. I actually meant that metaphorically, not literally. Okay, so what's really going on with all that stuff? I mean, in response to all these challenges, what are we seeing in the industry, right? I'll start with the top right, document authoring and document automation. So this is the other, it's like this Geico caveman moment where there's so much happening in technology today, but protocol authoring, which is perhaps one of the most important components or activities in clinical research, is actually done using MS Word and email. I mean, that's not the right way to do it. So we're seeing a lot of action happening in the industry. We ourselves actually have a product called the Protocol Creator, which is in beta release at many clients, which is a component-based, reusable, template-driven, collaborative, workflow-based approach to protocol authoring. It's also compliant, or it also aligns with the Transliterate standard protocol template. Very, very impactful, especially given that that's one of the most upstream processes in clinical research. Health literacy. I mean, this is an area where there's this person, David Cutler, who's a renowned professor of economics in Harvard, who actually wrote in the MIT review, the most unused person in healthcare today is the patient. Right? I mean, that's really, that's really what's happening today. I mean, healthcare has consistently been this paternalistic model of, the doctor knows best. That's actually changing, and it's changing, it's going upside down. Some of the work in this area, 35% of all of the patients drop out during the informed consent because they don't understand the document well enough. If you read this wonderful book by Dr. Eric Topol, which is The Patient Will See You Now, and it's an absolute must-read for anybody in life sciences. He says, it shouldn't be called informed consent. It should be called coerced consent. So we're doing some work there. We actually did a good piece of work where we looked at the informed consent, and some of our behavioral scientists actually, in addition to the informed consent itself, we actually created an infographic view of that so that patients can really understand what they're signing up for. And that actually impacted, to some extent, the patient enrollment rates in the trial. So some really good work happening there. Patient identification, it's not just the Apples and the Googles of the world with projects like Baseline who are doing this. There's some really good work happening in patient identification. There are use cases where at the time of protocol writing, based on what inclusion-exclusion criteria you put in, you can have a real-time query into an EMR, EHR data source, and it can actually tell you whether you're going to have patient population challenges and patient enrollment challenges based on that criteria. So that's really, really good work happening around patient identification. The other one is data ownership. How many of you have heard of this humanity.co? Okay, there's at least couple of them. So, humanity.co is leveraging blockchain to essentially give the patient control and allow the patient to negotiate the use of his or her data for not just clinical research, but any investigational study. So especially when your data is coming to you and your smartphone and it's in your control, you can actually say, I'll charge a couple of bucks for every clinical study. Right? Imagine the impact it has on clinical research, because it's not just in the control of the provider today. right? So there's some really amazing work that's happening in data ownership. Last but certainly not the least, I won't go over everything else, distributed clinical trials. So everybody talks about siteless trials. Some people even talk about patientless trials, which in some sense is science fiction still. But I actually asked a senior leader in R&D about, when can we really get to siteless trials at scale? And he said, you know what, there's a lot going on around this. E-consent, ECOA, patient-reported outcomes, wearables, use of digital technologies for patient education. So this, Uber-like approaches to bring the trial to the patient. So there's a lot going on. But he said a really remarkable thing. He said, the degrees of entropy in this are so much that it's really impossible to predict when and how it'll happen. But sure enough, you will see progression in all these areas. It'll move to a situation where you have these hybrid trials where all of these elements will take shape in some shape or form. So a lot of amazing stuff that's happening across all these areas. So just wanted to end with a thought, which is, again, something that a client mentioned is we're seeing such changes and disruptions using technology that hopefully one day, pretty soon, either our grandchildren or maybe even our children will actually look back and say that you guys actually medicated yourselves like in the medieval times. So with that said, very optimistic, great time to be in the industry, and thank you for having me.